Tonight, University Bookstore is very pleased to welcome Pulitzer Prize winner David Macomber, managing editor at the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, to talk about he and former PI reporter Andrew Schneider's book, An Air That Kills, How the Asbestos Poisoning of Libby, Montana Uncovered a National Scandal. For 60 years, the Grace Corporation blanketed a small Montana town in a poison dust, sickening a significant number of its own citizens, and all of it would have remained covered up had it not been for the investigative work of Macomber and Schneider. An Air That Kills is an expose of corporate negligence and an example of the free press at its most relevant and vital to our lives. Please welcome David Macomber.
That's good, I think. Thank you. Thank you very much, Matthew, and thank you to University Bookstore for having me here. I'd like to correct the record quickly. I'm not a Pulitzer Prize winner. My partner, my co-author, Andrew Schneider, is a double Pulitzer Prize winner. I was a finalist for one, but that's as close as I ever got. I also just have a couple of other quick thank yous to make. Seeing as how I'm reading in my hometown, I have to thank the newspaper I work for, the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, for the commitment that they made to allow us to pursue this story. It's an uncommon commitment in this day and age. This story took 16 months and a great deal of reporting work and expense, and I'm proud of the PI for doing that. I'm also greatly indebted to Andy Schneider, my co-author, who can't be here tonight. Unfortunately, I lost him to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. He's an amazing journalist, and people have asked me about taking on projects like this, and my advice is if you're going to write a piece of journalism like this, try to do it with a two-time Pulitzer Prize winner. Collaboration is never easy, but having a reporter of Andy's caliber certainly is a great thing. I'm going to read the prologue to this book because I think it says what this book's about, I hope, as well as I can say it. And then I'll be happy to take some questions and any conversation that you guys would like to indulge in. A single lodgepole pine from what's left of Zonalite Mountain would be plenty. Fell it, watch out for the cloud of dust. Skid it out, peel it, rip it into 1x4s, and sell it to a survivor of the plague on this place. It doesn't take much lumber to knock together 200 simple crosses. Take them to the body shop, prime them, spray them white, paint a name in black on each one. That's probably enough for this year if you don't look too hard into the past for more names. After all, for 6 decades, not one doctor put the actual words on a death certificate in Libby, Montana, asbestos-related disease. But now you're at it, don't stop making crosses. The little town of Libby will be needing 2,000 or 3,000 more. The federal government came in and did the biggest public health survey in its history. A third of the town got what Gayla Benefield accurately calls the death sentence. Mincing words is not her style. The town already knows many of the names that will need to be painted. Miners, sure, some of them, men who actually dug the death out of the mountain, hauled it, milled it, swept it, sacked it, breathed it for $2 or $3 an hour and glad to do it. Then wore it home on their clothes. Men like Les Scramstad. Here's the hard thing, many of the miners are already gone, and most of the names still to be painted are those of their wives and children and grandchildren. Still others on the list have no family connection, no way to know exactly where or when they inhaled enough of the dust that covers Libby to lodge tiny fibers of tremolite asbestos into their lungs to start the inexorable process of inflammation, pleural thickening, loss of lung function, fluid buildup, and slow suffocation. Some who might, in some obscene way, be considered lucky will go more quickly from lung cancer or mesothelioma, a fancy name for another kind of death sentence, a cancer of the lining of the lung. Death followed the vermiculite ore from Zonalite Mountain as closely as the asbestos fibers that contaminated it, followed it far from Libby, all across the country, to more than 300 processing plants, and farther yet. Today, in millions of homes, the hazardous material still rests in attics and walls to be sent into air and lungs with any disturbance. Asbestos from Libby was released into the air in New York City when the World Trade Center buildings collapsed. Nobody knows how many people have died from it, or where, or how many more will die. Hundreds of thousands more people will be exposed to asbestos from other sources in this country, from breaks, from contaminated talc, from other sources, from iron ore, from all the products containing asbestos that are still being legally manufactured and sold because of the power of an industry here and in Canada that has lied and covered up for a deadly century, and because of a government that has not protected us, its workers and consumers. In Libby, even as the Environmental Protection Agency struggles to clean up the toxic mess, some unknown number of the kids who show no sign of illness now, as they ride their bikes down quiet streets or crowd boisterously into the Pizza Hut after a ball game, will die the same way. That's what breaks Les Scramstad's heart and what makes Gayla Benefield madder than a stepped-on snake. Strong is a good word to describe Gayla. Picture Nordic blonde hair fighting the gray and an attractive functional cut and an expressive mouth equally comfortable with a smile, a kiss, or a swear word. I can say fuck you without moving my lips, she says sweetly, pushing her glasses up with an extended middle finger. Her blue eyes betray a quickness of thought and twinkle as a natural state of affairs, but go cold as Libby in February when the subject turns to asbestos, for good reason. She lost her mother and father to Libby's curse. Now she and her husband David are diagnosed with the disease. 62 members of their family have either died of the disease, have been diagnosed, or remain at high risk. Gayla was one of the first to fight in court to get the W.R. Grace Company, owner of the vermiculite mine with asbestos in the ore, to be found responsible for the dying. After achieving that, she has never stopped fighting for the victims and their families, not for an instant. At 67, Les Scramstad is still trim-waisted and muscular, and he still plays country music around town, as he has for 40 years. After he was diagnosed with asbestos in 1996, he became the first former miner to take Grace to trial and win, but that won't keep him alive. Since his trial, he has learned that his wife, Norita, and 2 of their children have the same disease that will kill him. I loved my job at Zonalite, he says quietly. Each of his shortening breaths is a gold coin to be spent wisely, and so he is very soft-spoken, even when his jaw sets and you can see the pain in his eyes. I loved it so much that even if they had told me I was endangering my life, I would probably have stayed. But if they told me it was killing my wife and my family, too, I would have run like hell. On this day, Memorial Day 2001, Gayla and Les put aside their anger and concentrated on honoring the victims. This year, for the first time, there was to be a public remembering and acknowledgement of the many who have died from asbestos. That alone was an enormous thing for a town that had suffered in silence for so long, a town literally left to die by every branch of every government charged with making sure something like this does not happen. A town that for so many years either did not know or did not acknowledge what was killing so many. By now, the truth was out, unavoidable. People around the world knew about the dying in Libby, and so it was only right some of the survivors decided that the dead should be honored. 2 men led this effort. Mike Switzer has been diagnosed with asbestosis. His was one of the first families to settle in Libby more than a century ago. Jim Roscoe has been diagnosed with asbestosis, so have 2 of his brothers and his sister. His effort is most ironic. His second cousin Mark was governor of Montana when the dying became public knowledge. In 1999, Mark Roscoe made concerned noises and did nothing of substance, many of his former neighbors in Libby say bitterly. Mike Switzer and Jim Roscoe got the materials for the crosses donated. They were built in Libby High School's shop class. The painting was done at Jean's Body Shop, and Stephanie Berry volunteered to paint the names. Some of the local real estate outfits and others at the Chamber of Commerce were a little nervous about putting the crosses where they'd be visible to everybody. They talked about putting them behind the chamber offices, out of the way. Mike Switzer even got a phone call or 2. What are you trying to do to our town? Gala went to the city council and suggested it would be a good idea to put the crosses at the cemetery where so many people from the town would be coming for Memorial Day. The cemetery rests in bottomland, not far off Highway 2, behind the Venture Inn. Look down and you'll see a serene sea of grass and marble, somehow uniquely Montanan. Alan Lewis Kendall, born August 3rd, 1936, died September 1st, 1998, is laid to rest beneath the epitaph, "One hell of a man," illustrated by engravings of a piece of earth-moving equipment and a cowboy on horseback. Look up and you'll see towering sentinels of jack pine and larch, and beyond, all along the horizon, the peaks of the Cabinet Mountains. A wild and spectacular range that dominates the landscape around Libby, but is only a fingernail on the huge outstretched hand of the Northern Rockies. Many people came to add flowers, to walk among the crosses, to read the names. Some were carting long green oxygen tanks by their sides, like Don Kading, who said cheerfully, "Well, my name might be here next year." It would be. Pastor Cam Foote of the Troy Baptist Church, who played baseball with Gala's son and at 35 has been diagnosed with asbestosis, conducted a short prayer service. Then Les read the list of asbestos dead. Look at Libby. Look at the scar of mining against the landscape. Look at the working men's houses where to this day tiny spears of asbestos hover in the air like a judge's sentence. Look at the people who walk to the post office with slow, shuffling steps, rolling what's left of their lives beside them in the green tanks. Look at this piece of ground filled with simple white crosses, and you can almost hear Maybelle Carter and Johnny Cash singing one of Les's favorite songs, "Undertaker, Undertaker, Undertaker, please drive slow, for that lady that you're hauling, Lord, I hate to see her go." What can I tell you about this project? Yeah.
How did you initially find out about it?
Well, you know, it's kind of a fluke and kind of not a fluke. The way it works seems like in journalism, often you're chasing one good story and one story leads to another story. And we had been spending, in the summer of 1999, we'd been working for about 6 months on a project on hard rock mining and looking at mining on public lands and what sort of damage was being done and the fact that there were billions of dollars in gold sort of going out of the nation's public lands to often to multinational corporations, so forth. So we'd gone around to 9 different states in the West chasing the story, and Montana was the last one, and we had a photographer and 2 reporters in the state, and they happened to hear something while they were working on the hard rock story about another mine up in Libby where some people might be sick. So I get a call saying, well, it's a 200-mile detour, and it's not the story we came to get, but I want to go look at it. And so thanks to Andy Schneider's persistence, he went and looked, and the more he looked, the more it just didn't seem right. We couldn't believe that a story of this size hadn't been reported, that nobody knew about it. And the more we looked at it, the more we realized that there had been an active conspiracy of silence on the part of the companies that ran the mine, and people just knew in the little town that some of the people who worked at the mine got sick, and nobody looked any farther than that. The medical community hadn't raised the alarm. And so the more we looked, the more we found, and it led us on quite a chase.
What's the population of this town?
6,000.
Oh,
So
what's the chemical composition of asbestos?
it's a mineral. You know, in this case, it's what they call a tramp mineral or a contaminant of this other ore. The vermiculite is what they were mining. They weren't mining asbestos, they were mining vermiculite. But in a lot of places, just geologically, vermiculite and tremolite asbestos are found together. And as a matter of fact, there's a vermiculite mine going full bore right now in Virginia that is contaminated with asbestos. It's another little Libby happening right now. It just happens to be that way geologically. Yeah.
So my question was how they were able to keep it quiet for so long when in the rest of the world in 1970, in the late 1970s, in the rest of the world, asbestos mines were closed. But I think you answered that by saying it was really a vermiculite one.
Well, there's a couple things to think about here. One is in Libby itself, the medical community, people who didn't even smoke were told that they were sick because of smoking. People who had asbestosis would get pneumonia every year, and they'd go into the hospital and they'd be treated for their pneumonia and they'd be sent home with no diagnosis of the underlying disease. Now, the one thing in the doctor's favor is, if you think about it historically, is at that time, it wasn't until people really understood what went on in Libby that it was known that you could contract asbestos-related disease in this way. I mean, it's always thought to be an occupational disease. In other words, you have to work around it for a long time to get the disease. But in Libby, there were no changing facilities at the mine. There were no showers, so the miners all came home with the dust on their clothes, and the dust was so toxic that their wives and children got sick. And eventually, there's just so much of it all over the town that people who had no connection to the mine got sick. So part of it was medical knowledge, but the fact is the medical community did know what was going on. In 1959, the owner of the mine started an X-ray program, chest X-ray program of the miners, and they found lung abnormalities in 130 miners that first year. Nobody told the miners. The doctors in town didn't tell the miners. The company didn't tell them. And finally, in the 80s, one doctor tried to blow the whistle and got run out of town, basically. So that's part of it. The mine ownership was involved with the hospital board, and it was just all a very sort of internal thing. The other part of it is the government that basically didn't do its job, both the state government, who discovered the asbestos in the ore in 1956 and wrote reports that were confidential, shown only to the management of the mine, and the federal government. The EPA, in 1975, the Scott's company that makes Scott's Turf Builder and so forth, in Ohio, they were using at that time almost a quarter of the total production of the Libby mine. They had a huge operation there. And their workers started getting lung disease, started getting pleural effusion, bleeding in the lungs. And EPA actually came in and did a study and discovered that it was because of the ore from Libby, and that the ore from Libby was toxic and contained asbestos. And that report got stuck in a file drawer and was not rediscovered until after the PI did the stories, and the EPA sent an emergency response team out there almost 2 decades later, and that team started looking in their own records and found that their own agency had covered this up. And the one plausible explanation for that is that in the early 80s, there was something called the Grace Commission, which was a commission that Ronald Reagan set up. It was run by a bunch of businessmen, specifically J. Peter Grace, who also owned the Grace Corporation that ran the mine. But the Grace Commission was charged with getting government off the backs of industry, the so-called streamlining government, making government more efficient and less intrusive. And somewhere in that process, it got so unintrusive that nobody ever did anything about the asbestos in Libby. Yeah.
How has it affected the town? I mean, as far as, I wouldn't want to move there knowing that, what the history.
Well, one of the obscene things about this is it's one of the most beautiful places imaginable. One of the prettiest places I've ever been on this planet. It's just a beautiful spot. But you're right, it has definitely affected the town. And a lot of people are really bitter about the publicity, sort of a slay the messenger situation where, our town was just fine until people started nosing around in this. Of course, people were dying of it, but that was, they felt that nobody should have raised a fuss about it. There are a lot fewer of those people now since after we did the stories in the PI, the federal government came in and did this survey and found that almost a third of the town has lung abnormality. So that, I think, really changed a lot of minds in town.
What's being done to clean up the town?
Well, you know, it's an interesting story because when 3 days after our stories came out, thank goodness for a guy named Bill Yellowtail, who was then the Region 8 EPA administrator. He was a rancher from Wyola, Montana, Crow Indian, amazing guy. Anyway, he was furious because we had quoted the EPA's state coordinator as saying this was strictly a personal hygiene problem on the part of the miners. He just went nuts, and he called in a top EPA emergency scene coordinator and a team of an epidemiologist and a public health doctor, and they came in and started looking and discovered the problem. They thought that we were wrong. They thought it was a classic case of journalists not knowing what they're talking about, and they found out that it was actually worse than what we'd said. So that launched a cleanup, the emergency part of which lasted about 3 years, and now they're into what's called long-term remediation. But they've spent $40 million so far, but they're not even close to getting it all cleaned up. And now, just like a lot of Superfund sites in the country, the money's running out from the federal government. There's a lot of pressure. It's just like what's going on at Hanford. There's a lot of pressure. Cut some corners, clean it up quick and dirty kind of an approach. And so there's a lot of people in Libby who are fighting that, trying to get the government to pay more attention. The head of the administrator of the EPA is going to be in Libby next month, and that could be kind of an interesting visit. Should be interesting to see what happens.
What have been the consequences for the Grace Company?
Well, in April of 2001, they declared bankruptcy. Right before that, they bought a company called Sealed Air Corporation, makes like FedEx pouches and mailing, packaging stuff. Small company. They transferred billions of dollars in assets to Sealed Air, and then they declared bankruptcy. Fortunately, the EPA has something called forensic accountants who basically track polluters' finances, and they took them to federal court in Missoula, and it looks like that they're going to get some of that money, access back to some of that money, but there are a lot of people who filed lawsuits, obviously, against Grace. Right now, there's something in the Congress called the Asbestos Fairness Act. I prefer to think of it as the Asbestos Industry Relief Act. That basically would make it a lot easier for all companies involved in asbestos to evade responsibility for. And part of the problem is the trial lawyers too. I mean, there are a lot of frivolous asbestos suits out there. What they do is they run these screening clinics, and if you find a shadow on your lung, they sue everybody who ever made asbestos and take a couple $1,000 and give it, you know, and take 30% of it, or 40. So there's been a lot of that, and it's been an abuse, but the upshot of that is that a lot of people who are truly sick and who have had relatives die aren't getting anything. So it's a big problem, and the shocking thing to me is how widespread it still is. And most people don't understand that asbestos is still perfectly legal in this country. It's legal to manufacture it, products containing asbestos, to import it, whatever. There was an attempt at banning it in the 90s, and under pressure from industry, it got overturned, and the government didn't appeal it, and so there is no ban on asbestos in the country today. There's still asbestos in brakes. Most people, most mechanics, most parts shop people don't think there is. There is in a lot of brakes. Some not, but there is in some, and there's 750,000 professional mechanics out there, and a lot of backyard mechanics who are still at risk. We found asbestos. We started testing consumer products as part of this investigation, and we found, to our horror, that there was asbestos in crayons, Crayolas, a couple other brands of American-made crayons. We couldn't believe it. I mean, we'd heard that there was talc in crayons, and we knew there was asbestos in some talc, so we tested some, and we couldn't believe the results, so we retested. Came up the same way. So we wrote a story saying there was asbestos in crayons, and it was like a bomb went off, as you can imagine. You know, people talk about slay the messenger. People were really upset with us for raising the possibility that their kids' crayons might have asbestos in them. But nonetheless, the first thing that happened was the industry issued a statement saying there is no asbestos in crayons. No, we haven't tested for it because it's not there. And then Benny and Smith, who owns Crayola, hired a so-called independent lab to test crayons, and they tested one crayon and came back and said there was no asbestos in it. And then we wrote a story that said that the lab they chose had made $7 million testifying for the asbestos industry. So finally the government stepped in. We were really out on a limb. Finally the government stepped in after decades of doing nothing on asbestos. The Consumer Product Safety Commission stepped in and did some testing and found the same thing we found. And so within a week, all the major crayon manufacturers said, we'll take it out. They did so. We then tracked back to try to figure out where it came from, and it wasn't a talc, and it was all from a talc mine in upper New York, in upstate New York, called the Vanderbilt Talc Company. And they had been fighting asbestos regulation for many years and continue to fight and continue to mine talc there, and miners are continuing to die there. So it's really all over in society. It's interesting. Yeah?
Isn't it true that legislation has been introduced to ban it, though?
Well, Patty Murray, thankfully, read our stories in the PI. She has introduced a rider on Orrin Hatch's Asbestos Fairness Act that would ban, that would be a ban. I think its prospects for passage are not great, frankly. I hope it passes, but I don't think the odds are very good in this Congress.
What other products have asbestos in it?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, certainly some, I think there's still wallboard being made that has it. The EPA has tested various construction products and has found it in some. I think the EPA's website probably has some of that stuff listed. I think that there is probably still some asbestos in vermiculite products because I know, I'll give you an example, this mine in Virginia. Grace used to own the property there, and they sold it because they did tests and found out that the ore was contaminated with asbestos. They sold it to a guy who now owns the mine, is now mining it. He's a former assistant administrator of the EPA. He worked in the Nixon White House. He owns the mine. For years and years, the Mine Safety and Health Administration had been doing inspections there and finding nothing. After some of our stories came out, the administrator of M. Shaw under Clinton called us up and said, you know, our agencies should be disgraced for what happened and ashamed for what happened in Libby and what's happening elsewhere, and we're going to make sure it never happens again. They sent a surprise team of inspectors into that mine, and they found ore up to 99% asbestos in that mine. They shut off some areas of the mine. They cited the mine. They warned the miners, told them to wear protective gear. They put warning signs all over the place. And on January 20th, 2001, the cones came down, the warning signs came down, and that mine is progressing full bore. So I'd be very concerned about products with vermiculite in them. Lawn products. The big thing is to not expose yourself to the dust, not dump the bag out, and that sort of thing. The other real concern, consumer concern, I think, is the old zonalite insulation from Libby. Is in anywhere from 15 to 35 million homes in the country. It's loose fill insulation. It's in attics, and it's not going to hurt you if it's just in your attic and it's not coming through ceiling tile or anything, if it's just in your attic. But as soon as you remodel, as soon as the cable installer goes up there, as soon as you do anything that could disturb it, it gets in the air, and it is very toxic. And it's a big problem. Whenever a house like that is demolished, it's a problem. So that's something to really be aware of, especially if you have an older home.
Is Libby any safer now than it was 5 years ago or whatever?
I think so. I mean, they've done some good things. For years and years, there were piles of vermiculite ore downtown in Libby, and the kids would swing on ropes and land in it. You know, it's like a big sandbox. And you know, the ice rink at Plummer School in Libby was all vermiculite underneath. The track at the high school was made out of vermiculite. The ball fields had it all over. Those things have been cleaned up. Some of the other areas have been cleaned up in town. There are still a lot of houses. They gave the stuff away free to people in town for insulation and for gardens, and so it's just all over the town, as well as what came in the air, you know. So there's still a lot of houses that need to be cleaned up, but most of the public sites have been cleaned up.
How do they store that stuff? Do they bury it in the ground or what?
Yeah, they do. They bury it and cover it up. Yeah.
How did the asbestos industry get all of this political power in the first place? Like, did it just randomly, they just paid people off, or?
Well, I think it's you know, a big piece of it. I'll take the Canadian piece. There's a big asbestos industry in Canada. It's not that many jobs, but the thing is, it's in Quebec, and so it's become a sort of been all wrapped up in separatist politics in Canada, and so nobody wants to touch the asbestos industry because it's just basically a political sacred cow. In this country, some of the major it's sort of the big lie theory. It's like if you're big enough, you can get away with it. And a lot of these companies are enormous companies that have been very successful. Johns Manville, Ray Bestos, Dresser Industries, you know, Grace, certainly one of the biggest. And the list it's a long list, but it's basically a list of, it's a chunk of corporate America. And I think it's just like any other situation, and the Vanderbilt talc is a good example. They certainly had local senators and congressmen doing their bidding because it was a matter of jobs. So the question of, it's the whole lobbying process, the whole political process, really. It's a perfect example of it. But it is really an ugly piece of American corporate history.
Is the Bush administration doing anything to address this problem? And did the Clinton administration do anything really to address it besides what you were talking about in Virginia?
Well, the answer is no and almost nothing. Certainly, the EPA under Carol Browner and Clinton did not cover itself with glory on asbestos. There are a lot of decisions that could have been made that went the wrong way. One thing that I certainly learned comes through in the research we did for this. There are some wonderful people in the government. There are some very dedicated people who are trying to protect the public safety, trying to do their jobs. And they basically are not only at war with the polluters, but they're at war with their own higher-ups in the agency, and they're at war with the administration. Certainly, things got worse after in the current administration. There's just no denying that. You know, when 9/11 happened, the levels of asbestos that were released in the air in Lower Manhattan are just incredible. And two days after 9/11, Christy Whitman stood in New York and said the air is safe to breathe. And EPA's own research showed that it wasn't. EPA completely moon suit workers, the whole thing, decontaminated their own offices in Manhattan, but didn't do much for anybody else. If you read, it's hard not to get cynical. If you read EPA's reports on post 9/11 asbestos in Manhattan, you read the summary report, you think everything is pretty well handled, and then you read the detail of the research, and you realize that the levels are very dangerous.
As a journalist, are you encouraged to follow up these kinds of stories? Because it seems like it's a public good, but you must have to do a lot of research to get one story out.
It's what we do, and this is the great thing. I mentioned the PI's commitment to this story. I mean, it's sort of our responsibility to attack these kinds of stories as well as the easier, the lower hanging fruit that we get in the paper every day. You know, it's important that we spend some resources and some time doing this kind of work and being a watchdog for the public interest. And I was very fortunate in this case to have a wonderful reporter, an indomitable reporter who would not take no for an answer on this story. And having that kind of expertise and being able to have the commitment to the story is just what it takes.
I'm going to take one more question.
I was just going to ask, not everyone in Libby has asbestosis. Who does have it? Who's most susceptible to it?
Well, the thing is, nobody knows when the incidence of asbestosis in Libby is even going to peak. The latency period of the disease is so long that it's part of the reason that companies can evade responsibility. It's part of the reason, you know, that it went unnoticed for so long or unreported for so long in Libby is because it's an old person's disease. I mean, often people who get it are in their 60s, 70s, but it is a truly horrible way to die and a very expensive way to die. So it's hard to say how many people will get it. As I say, I think there are somewhere between 1,800 and 2,000 people who have been diagnosed with lung abnormality in Libby. There may be more down the road because there's still an exposure, and that's what frightens a lot of people who are there looking at it. The other thing is that the screening is really a double-edged sword, because once people have gone through that screening, they can't get insurance. If they are found to have that, it really affects their ability to get insurance. And so there's this huge, almost incalculable, unfunded medical situation in Libby, and will be for many years.
Does asbestos have a negative effect on plants?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Would you compare like the political power of the asbestos industry to the tobacco companies and the oil companies in terms of special interest groups in the government, or?
I think it's a very parallel comparison. I think it's a very apt comparison. But in terms of what's bigger, I think it's all of a piece. It's the same process.
So they're similar in terms of their power in the government.
Is the media doing its job on this beyond the PI? I mean,
some certainly have. You know, Spokane, after we did this story, the Spokane paper has followed up as a wonderful reporter in Spokane who's spent a lot of time on this story. There are others. The New York Times has been strangely silent on this story, but others have done a good job with it, and I think will probably continue to.
Okay, well, at this point, if you would like to ask another question, maybe we can come up and while he's signing your book.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Out of the mountain, hauled it, milled it, swept it, sacked it, breathed it for $2 or $3 an hour, and glad to do it. Then wore it home on their clothes. Men like Les Scramstad. Here's the hard thing, many of the miners are already gone, and most of the names still to be painted are those of their wives and children and grandchildren. Still others on the list have no family connection, no way to know exactly where or when they inhaled enough of the dust that covers Libby to lodge tiny fibers of tremolite asbestos into their lungs to start the inexorable process of inflammation, pleural thickening, loss of lung function, fluid buildup, and slow suffocation. Some who might in some obscene way be considered lucky will go more quickly from lung cancer or mesothelioma, a fancy name for another kind of death sentence, a cancer of the lining of the lung. Death followed the vermiculite ore from Zonalite Mountain as closely as the asbestos fibers that contaminated it, followed it far from Libby, all across the country, to more than 300 processing plants, and farther yet. Today, in millions of homes, the hazardous material still rests in attics and walls. And then I'll be happy to take some questions and any conversation that you guys would like to indulge in. A single lodgepole pine from what's left of Zonalite Mountain would be plenty. Fell it, watch out for the cloud of dust. Skid it out, peel it, rip it into 1x4s, and sell it to a survivor of the plague on this place. It doesn't take much lumber to knock together 200 simple crosses. Take them to the body shop, prime them, spray them white, paint a name in black on each one. That's probably enough for this year if you don't look too hard into the past for more names. After all, for 6 decades, not one doctor put the actual words on a death certificate in Libby, Montana, asbestos-related disease. But now you're at it, don't stop making crosses. The little town of Libby will be needing 2,000 or 3,000 more. The federal government came in and did the biggest public health survey in its history. A third of the town got what Gayla Benefield accurately calls the death sentence. Mincing words is not her style. The town already knows many of the names that will need to be painted. Miners, sure, some of them. Men who actually dug the death owls to be sent into air and lungs with any disturbance. Asbestos from Libby was released into the air in New York City when the World Trade Center buildings collapsed. Nobody knows how many people have died from it, or where, or how many more will die. Hundreds of thousands more people will be exposed to asbestos from other sources in this country, from breaks, from contaminated talc, from other sources, from iron ore, from all the products containing asbestos that are still being legally manufactured and sold because of the power of an industry here and in Canada that has lied and covered up for a deadly century, and because of a government that has not protected us, its workers and consumers. In Libby, even as the Environmental Protection Agency struggles to clean up the toxic mess, some unknown number of the kids who show no sign of illness now as they ride their bikes down quiet streets or crowd boisterously into the Pizza Hut after a ball game will die the same way. That's what breaks Les Scramstad's heart and what makes Gayla Benefield madder than a stepped-on snake. Strong is a good word to describe Gayla. Picture Nordic blonde hair fighting the gray and an attractive functional cut and an expressive mouth equal.
Tonight, University Bookstore is very pleased to welcome Pulitzer Prize winner David Macomber, managing editor at the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, to talk about he and former PI reporter Andrew Schneider's book, An Air That Kills, How the Asbestos Poisoning of Libby, Montana Uncovered a National Scandal. For 60 years, the Grace Corporation blanketed a small Montana town in a poison dust, sickening a significant number of its own citizens, and all of it would have remained covered up had it not been for the investigative work of Macomber and Schneider. An Air That Kills is an expose of corporate negligence and an example of the free press at its most relevant and vital to our lives. Please welcome David Macomber.
That's good, I think. Thank you. Thank you very much, Matthew, and thank you to University Bookstore for having me here. I'd like to correct the record quickly. I'm not a Pulitzer Prize winner. My partner, my co-author, Andrew Schneider, is a double Pulitzer Prize winner. I was a finalist for one, but that's as close as I ever got. I also just have a couple of other quick thank yous to make. Seeing as how I'm reading in my hometown, I have to thank the newspaper I work for, the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, for the commitment that they made to allow us to pursue this story. It's an uncommon commitment in this day and age. This story took 16 months and a great deal of reporting work and expense, and I'm proud of the PI for doing that. I'm also greatly indebted to Andy Schneider, my co-author, who can't be here tonight. Unfortunately, I lost him to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. He's an amazing journalist, and people have asked me about taking on projects like this, and my advice is if you're going to write a piece of journalism like this, try to do it with a 2-time Pulitzer Prize winner. Collaboration is never easy, but having a reporter of Andy's caliber certainly is a great thing. I'm going to read the prologue to this book because I think it says what this book's about, I hope, as well as I can say it.